My father was not a good man. I know this. But when I think of him, I first recall his warmth, his kindness, and his strength. I remember vividly watching him toil away at backbreaking labor to support us. I was amazed by the strength of his hands, and how gentle they were with me. And then my stomach drops into a pit because now I know that with those same hands, he took the lives of countless innocent people. My earliest memory is of him. I was 4 and I was trying to convince him to let me take in a stray dog I had found wandering in an abandoned lot. We can't. It'd be too much trouble to lug the mutt around. We have a hard enough time with just the 2 of us. He said, we can leave him with lots of food until we come back. I countered, dogs aren't like people. They're bound by instinct. If you leave a month's worth of food out for a dog, it won't ration its food out so that it can eat happily for a month. No, it'll gorge itself and eat all the food available to it. That's its nature, its instinct. And once there's nothing left and hunger creeps in, it might go out into the world in search of a new meal. And we've already learned that its instinct is to consume as much as it can while it can. That's why we're around, to control that which is bestial. He said, his eyes tainted with an existential melancholy. Even now when I think about it, a trickle of cold sweat crawls achingly slow down the side of my brow. He was so close to telling me the truth back then. I wondered if the possibility of passing on his burden was what caused the derailment of his life lesson. Our life was unconventional, spent in countless cheap, dirty roadside motels as we trekked aimlessly through the states. Sometimes we slept in abandoned lots and dark parking lots, and on cold nights we clung to each other, knowing that there was no one else in the world that would care for us but us. He tried his best to provide for me, and I never went hungry. Even on our worst days, his patience and understanding were unmatched by any man I have known since. The first time I suspected my father was involved in something grisly was when I was 9. He had left me alone in our motel with the TV on and a pizza box. He must have been gone for 11 hours at least, and I began to worry that something terrible happened to him. The entire week something had been off. There was a heaviness in the air, and a chill seemed to stalk us. It was the middle of a brutal summer, but every enclosed space I found myself in was wicked of its heat until the very breaths I exhaled were visible. I noticed that my father was suffering from some mental fatigue, was more irritable than usual, and had a mounting nervousness that made him quick to sequester us in our hotel. He left that day saying that there was something he needed to do but promised he'd be back. But as the clock neared 1 a.m., I was afraid that I'd never see him again. The relief I felt when he rushed into our hotel room was short-lived when I saw the state he was in. His dark hair was disheveled, splattered with a slick substance, and his eyes were crazed. What stood out most of all was the angry red lines crisscrossing his face and neck. He told me to get my things as he quickly made his way into the shower. I did as I was told. The panicked tone of his voice infused a frenzy into my movements, and all I owned was half haphazardly thrown into my backpack. My father stepped out of the shower, and as he dressed I noticed the deep scratches raked into his forearms and back. Even at that age it was unmistakable. Violence. We drove away from that motel in silence, with no alarm or danger given voice by my father. But an undeniable sense of wrongness lingered in the air, heavy and undispellable. I knew deep in the pit of my gut that we had committed some great evil. Dad, however, was at ease, as if some great weight had just been lifted off his shoulders, and as days passed I noticed the stalking cold had faded. 3 years passed and I had smartened up by then, and as I began to recall and re-examine, I began to piece things together. Through the layers of denial and rationalization, I knew what he had done. I held on to the hope that the motel incident was the last time, that we could move forward and with time, forget. And then he killed Morgan. There was a build-up to it, that same strange chill, the sense of impending doom. And then Dad left like he always did. And when he came back, the stalking specter was gone, and so was Morgan. I didn't know him, couldn't bring myself to even look into him even now. I only caught wind of him through a radio broadcast as we hastily left yet another small town. My dad quickly switched stations and I knew it had been him. I think he knew that I knew then. The nervousness in both our eyes communicating more between us than we'd ever could with words. I took part in my first murder at 15. It wasn't planned. wasn't a rite of passage. It was more like a car crash, flying at 120 miles per hour straight into the embankment. Her name was Lori Artwood, a local prostitute. I forced myself to look this time, even if it was a glance at a driver's license moments before it was tossed into flames. Her name, her face, all seared into the flesh of my mind. It was the moment she stepped out bloodied and starry-eyed as a curtain of blood cascaded down the side of her head. A flap of flesh dangled loosely from her scalp, weighed and dragged down by curly auburn hair. As we locked eyes and hope flushed into her iris, I looked away and saw the crimson-slicked and chipped exposed skull. She screamed then, and I flinched and doubled back at her, seeing the desperate sprint she made towards the car I had been sleeping in. Dad closed the distance, spriting on long, powerful legs, the glint of a deadly metal arc flashing briefly in the moonlight before he brought the axe down with a powerful and meaty thwack. I saw the light leave her eyes as the floor rushed up to meet her. Dad pried the axe loose with a foot and brought it down thrice more. I watched in horror, spewing vomit and tears as a blood rain coated the floor and car. I was comatose by the time he finally entered the driver's seat. The crazed look from 6 years earlier was mirrored, and I knew he had always been like this. He chanted "fuck" under his breath, like a mantra, as he scrambled to start the car, and when the engine roared to life, silence fell like a guillotine. We drove off into the night, and I was left with the knowledge that I had killed her with my inaction. Dawn was starting to peek through the horizon when we finally came to some unnamed backwater town with a self-serve car wash. I watched as Dad fed the machine a handful of quarters and proceeded to wash the car clean. The cold spray made the bitter morning cold all the harsher, and with each passing moment, I felt the question, the demand bubbling up inside me. "Why?" I asked, quietly. It cleaved through the whir and sound of pressurized water, and Dad heard it, turned to face me, and said soon. So we waited until the water ran clear and the sun rose, and off we drove to some far-flung forest edge where he pulled over. A cigarette was lit, and Dad took a long drag until his lungs hurt and he couldn't hold it any longer. He breathed the plume of smoke out, painting the world gray, and held out the cigarette to me, and I answered with a contemptuous glare. "All right. I guess it's time you knew. You'd find out sooner or later. This thing will pass on to you eventually," he said. "Thing? You've felt it before. I'm sure you have. The way it hungers, the way it loathes, and the way it schemes." "What are you talking about?" I asked, but in the pit of my stomach, I had an inkling of what he meant. He reached out, and for a moment I froze. But this was my dad. He wouldn't hurt me. Couldn't. So I let him take hold of my shoulders and turn me to face the sunrise. "If it's here, it means they haven't found her body yet. You can't see it by looking through your eyes. Think of what you have and what you've lost. What I've taken from you because I couldn't bear the thought of doing this alone. I did. I could have had a normal life. Friends, a family, first love. Anything but this vagrant lifestyle. Knowing the person you cherished the most was a monster and having him drag you into his hell." And then I felt the sting of tears in my eyes, a longing blossoming and the crushing weight of its existence. "Now show yourself," he said. And in the glow of the morning sun, it did. I didn't know if the thing was malformed or degraded, just that it didn't belong. Multiple forms convened and interlaced within the same space. Upon a glance, it was a human silhouette, weaved in shadow. But in that same instance, it was a cuboid thing, far too large for the space it existed in. Its surface pocked and scarred by clockwork machinery, passages, and labyrinthian tunnels. It was constantly turning, shifting, and restructuring. I didn't know where to look. If I focused on its maze-like circuitry, I would lose myself in the maddening scramble to navigate them. And if I saw the black of its being, I would that beneath it all was a maw that opened wide and lapped hungrily at the world around it, feeding on something that still evaded me. I tried to recoil, tried to move away from it, but Dad caught me and held me firm, forcing me to gaze into the thing. Its once semi-translucent form grew vivid and real, solidifying its existence. A cloud of black smoke was being pulled from me into the hungry maws of its shadow self, and in turn the machinery and clockworks of its exterior. It was devouring some part of me, and it horrified me enough to try to turn and run, but Dad's firm hands held me still as he spoke. I think it might have had a purpose at one point, to lessen the weight of some great tragedy. But with time, even blessings can become curses. I don't know why it latched onto us, whether it was born or made, just that it needs to feed. And if we don't feed it and control its urges, it might go out into the world and gorge itself on the grief it brings. The knowledge that I'm sparing the world from the havoc it could wreak is my sin and burden. And now, yours. I stood transfixed, gaze locked on the thing that fed on grief and stalked our bloodline, and then it came to me. A question I had pondered but never voiced. What happened to Mom? I turned to face him and saw him drowning in pain, in guilt, in remorse. He looked away, and I knew. The world spun as bile threatened to force its way up. My lip quivered as I turned away, preferring to face the grief-devouring demon. But it had already faded to a phantasm. A moment later, nothing remained. They found her, was all my father said before he got back in the car. The moment of hesitation dragged out for what felt like an eternity, but eventually, I was in the passenger seat alongside him, wondering how long this thing would be able to feed on the grief my father wrought that night before he'd have to do it again. 2 years. 2 short years before the grief demon manifested again. I understood now why it stuck close to us, why no suspicion ever came to us. It was a parasite, leeching from whoever it could with the least amount of effort. I tried telling Dad if we let it starve it would go somewhere else, but he feared the lengths it would to feed itself. The world is drowning in pain. There's no shortage of ways for it to gorge itself. I told him, I can't risk that. No one should suffer this. No one but me. And he was off, searching for his next victim, unaware it was the last time we'd see each other. He never found them. Not that night. When he returned to the motel, he found it empty. I took what I had and caught a bus to anywhere else, and kept going until I no longer could. The monstrous thing followed me for a night, but when I greeted the following dawn, it was gone, and I knew Dad was the one grieving. The lump in my heart wasn't heavy enough to turn my pace. I kept moving because it was all I could do. I found a job as a laborer, taking whatever anyone was willing to give me, and for 2 years I broke my back scrounging change for nothing. Half a year ago, I came home to my shitty apartment. Opening the door, I was greeted by a bone-deep chill, and I froze. In the center of the room, upon a thrifted coffee table, it stood, crouched itself. The labyrinthian clockwork had slowed to a crawl, and their underlying hungry mouths lapped up at the empty air. Some of them grinned at me, expectantly. A scream tried to tear its way up my body, but it was drowned out by something else, a smoldering emotion on the verge of catching flame. As the implication of the demon's appearance settled in, I felt it. Grief. And then I cried. I cried for all I had lost and for what I never had. I cried, hoping to drown a space within me that grew with every second. As I collapsed into myself as the mechanisms of this thing unwound and opened and encircled me. A moss bit down deep on the flames of my pain, and I drowned in the crushing weight of its presence, suffocated by my fire and its hunger. I was immobilized by it at first, as it fed on the grief cultivated over a lifetime. Days passed, then weeks, and then a month before a moment of clarity. A burden eased and I sought him out, claimed his body, and did what I could. It wasn't much, but the tiny urn they gave me could at least be carried until I found the courage to let him go. I've carried them ever since. Their weight is great, and some days I buckle and fall, but I know that with each passing day, it gets easier, even if only a little. It won't ever fade completely. I know that, but one day it'll be okay. I'll climb to his favorite cliffside, one that overlooked a redwood forest, and there I'll toss our burdens to the wind. Let them be scattered, and be returned to the earth. The demon might stick around a bit longer, maybe much longer than anticipated. But I won't let it be my cross to bear. I don't know what it'll do. Maybe it'll latch onto someone else. Maybe it will coast through the world feeding on the suffering as it passes them. Maybe Dad was right and it'll gorge on the whole of the world's grief until it can't. Somehow I doubt that. Not through any logical reasoning, but because it's what I have to believe if I want to live with myself. The only thing I know is that I'll keep trudging forward until I can.